Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 21st of May and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. As we often do on a Friday, we're going to focus mainly on one area, and this week it will be the latest impacts of Brexit on the agricultural sector, the proposed Australian trade deal and the future for Scottish farming and food production. In discussing that, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by two eminently qualified guests. Firstly, we are joined once more by the campaigner Ruth Watson. Ruth founded and has propelled the Keep Scotland a Brand campaign for many years, speaking tirelessly and, for example, giving evidence at Westminster. Her campaign is a positive initiative which encourages consumers to stand up for Scotland's farmers, fishermen and our food and drink industry. Good evening, Ruth. Thank you for joining us this evening. How are things in Angus?
Yes, things in Angus are, well, they're pretty dreich, but apart from that, it's okay. My tatties are refusing to come through, but I don't think that's going to be very... I know some farmers here don't even have the tatties in yet, so I guess I'm doing okay that they're in.
Absolutely right. And secondly, we're also joined by Jim Fairlie, MSP. Jim is the Scottish National Party MSP for Perthshire South and Kinross-shire constituency. He was elected on the 6th of May this year and succeeds Rosanna Cunningham as the MSP. Originally from Perth, Jim became a sheep farmer, shepherding for 13 years in the northeast corner of the Ochils, and in 1996 he launched Perth Farmers Market, which was the first one in Scotland. Jim now runs his own farm, Kindrum Park, just outside Methven, where he rears his own lamb, mutton and beef. In the past 5 years, he and his family have also developed their ready-to-eat business, The Kitchen Farmer. They produce and sell a burger unlike any other, and you have my word for that. Good evening, Jim. Thank you for joining us. And how are you doing?
I'm very well, Andrew. I'm very well. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I should just point out I no longer farm. I haven't been in Kindrum Park for a year or two now. I came out of the farm so that we could focus on other areas. So, but I've been involved in farming for the last 30 years, as you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I should ask, have you come back down to earth since the election?
Yes, yes. It's been a bit of a head spin.
Excellent, thank you.
It's the first time I've stood for Parliament, and it's been a bit of a crazy ride, but delighted to be here.
Thanks, Jim. So first this evening, we will look at today's coronavirus update and the news headlines. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,993,798 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,762,516 have been confirmed negative, and 231,282 have tested positive. There are 414 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID infection now stands at 7,664. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 81 were in hospital last night, 4 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,082,251 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,769,040 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 127,710 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 9 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Next, we have an update on COVID levels and travel restrictions. Murray will be the only local authority area to change protection level as it moves to level 2 at midnight tonight. And that is following improvement of the coronavirus COVID-19 prevalence there. Data available this morning showed that in the last week, case rates in Moray have fallen sharply from 98 per 100,000 to 37 per 100,000. And cases of the April 02 variant, what was the so-called Indian variant, are lower there than in other parts of the country. Both the proportion of cases and of positive tests have continued to rise in Glasgow, with the April 02 variant thought to be driving the spread, meaning that the city will remain in level 3 for at least another week. Enhanced testing, vaccination and public health measures will continue to attempt to contain the spread, and enhanced contact tracing may mean close contacts of close contacts are asked to self-isolate and to book a test. A further £1.05 million per week has been made available to Glasgow City Council to provide additional support for businesses and hospitality and leisure in Glasgow, and that's at up to £750 per week. East Renfrewshire will see public health efforts intensified to tackle an increase in prevalence there, but will remain in level 2 for now and be monitored closely. According to this morning's data, cases as a proportion of the population there have increased to 118 per 100,000 people in the last week, though many of these can be traced to specific household clusters. Everyone in Glasgow and East Renfrewshire is encouraged to get tested to help stop the spread of COVID-19 by finding cases that might be missed, as around 1 in 3 people with COVID-19 do not have symptoms. Travel from Scotland to 3 local authority areas in England will be restricted from midnight on Monday the 24th of May 2021 due to sustained high prevalence of the virus in Bedford, Bolton and Blackburn with Darwen. This will be reviewed in a week along with the other measures announced today. People can travel freely throughout most of Scotland and between most of Scotland and the rest of the UK, other than to or from Glasgow. Meanwhile, at Westminster, the SNP leader Ian Blackford MP has said that Boris Johnson has betrayed Scottish farmers and crofters with Tory plans for a post-Brexit trade deal that threatens the interests of Scotland's agricultural sector. Responding to the news, the Tory government is to offer Australia a deal which will give tariff and quota-free access to Australian beef and lamb. Ian Blackford said the move showed Scotland's interests have been thrown under the Brexit bus. Mr Blackford said the move threatened the viability of many Scottish farms and crofts by undercutting the price and standards of Scottish beef and lamb, and could wreck the way of life that has existed across Scotland for generations. It comes as Australia's biggest beef exporter predicted it could increase UK sales by tenfold under a zero-tariff, zero-quota trade deal of the kind being proposed by the Tory government. At Holyrood, the Scottish Greens have unveiled their spokespeople that will cover the various government portfolios. Co-leader Patrick Harvie will continue to speak on finance and constitutional issues, while fellow co-leader Lorna Slater will lead on the 2 issues central to the Scottish Greens election campaign: economic recovery from the pandemic and a green industrial strategy to lower Scotland's carbon emissions. In international news, world leaders have hailed a ceasefire that took hold in the early hours of this morning and vowed to rebuild Gaza after an Israeli bombing campaign that killed more than 230 people and Palestinian rocket attacks that killed 12 in Israel. The United Nations Secretary General urged Israel and Gaza's Hamas rulers to observe the ceasefire and called upon global leaders to develop a reconstruction package that supports the Palestinian people and strengthens their institutions. Antonio Guterres said after yesterday's announcement of an end to 11 days of clashes, Israeli and Palestinian leaders have a responsibility beyond the restoration of calm to start a serious dialogue to address the root causes of the conflict. Few analysts believe that there will be progress towards resolving the fundamental issues in the immediate future. There were no signals of an end to Israel's decades-old military grip over the Palestinian territories and its blockade on the already devastated Gaza enclave, within which 2 million people live in what some human rights activists have described as an open-air prison. However, Guterres said the UN was ready to work with Israel, the Palestinians, and others to return to meaningful negotiations on a two-state settlement based on territorial lines before the 1967 war. Meanwhile, back in London, the National Audit Office report into the running of the Windrush compensation scheme has found that the scheme has so far failed to meet its objective of compensating claimants quickly. The report found that the number of people who have received payments has increased since December 2020, but operational challenges remain. Commenting on the investigation, SNP Shadow Immigration Minister Anne McLaughlin MP said that the Windrush scandal is one of the most disgraceful episodes in modern British politics, and a shocking indictment of the careless and callous attitude of the UK Home Office and successive UK governments over the decades, adding that these latest sorry figures and the fact that 21 people have now died before receiving the compensation they were owed show that nothing has changed. Ms McLaughlin said that instead of trying to do all it can to make up for the scandal that affected so many lives, the Home Office is dragging its feet on compensating the victims and, on top of this, repeatedly ignoring the SNP's calls for reinstatement of legal aid to Windrush victims in England. Windrush victims deserve to be justly compensated for the outrageous treatment by the Tory government, and they deserve that compensation in a timely manner, not years after, Ms McLaughlin said. And finally, EU citizens living and working in the UK have revealed how they are being met with suspicion and threats that they will be refused entry at the UK border for the first time in their lives, fueling fresh fears that border force officials have not been trained in the new Brexit rules. Wolfgang, a German national who runs an IT business, was detained at Heathrow Airport despite having proof of settled status, indefinite leave to remain, and a British passport on the way. He is furious that his rights were suspended on the whim of a border force official. "I have settled status," he said. "I have indefinite leave to remain. I am about to become a British citizen. How is it that a border official with one tick can suspend those rights?" Hilary Benn MP, the former chair of the now disbanded Commons Brexit Select Committee, said cases such as Wolfgang's raise concerns about what is in store for the 4.9 million EU citizens who have already been granted settled or pre-settled status, especially as they start to return from visits to their countries of birth when COVID restrictions are lifted. And those are this evening's headlines. Now then, Ruth and Jim, we're going to turn now to discussing your specialist subject this evening. We can already see the major disruptions being caused to fishing and food-producing families and businesses who are currently losing millions of pounds as a direct result of Brexit. We have read about and reported on Broadcasting Scotland the current disruptions to Scotland's farming economy, meat and dairy exports to the EU collapsing, and soft fruit and vegetable picking being made nearly impossible due to the disappearance of the majority of migrant seasonal workers. So as we come to the end of May 2021, Jim, what's your sense of the current status of farming businesses across Scotland right now?
In reality, farming businesses aren't feeling the pain of Brexit yet. Lamb prices are at record highs. Beef prices are very strong. We've got a buoyant trade in the livestock centres. So the real kick from Brexit hasn't happened yet. Sorry, I'm getting feedback on my line. Hello. All I'm getting is feedback.
Okay, that's all right. We'll come back to Jim. We'll get Jim's line sorted out. Ruth, what's your sense of the current status of farming businesses across Scotland right now?
I've been chatting to farmers up the glens, so there's rare occasions you can get out in amongst the rares, and they're really happy with sheep prices. They're actually going to go, it'd be great because lamb's doing better in the auction than for years. And so I think that there is this sense that actually everything's going to be fine, and it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you have ever watched that film, The Perfect Storm, but it kind of feels like that we're sort of in the lull, sort of the people are sort of playing on the beach while the white shark is sort of like lurking behind the seaweed, and everyone thinks it's all sunny uplands. I look at my shop shelves and I see that there are vegetable shortages that were not there before. I go to my local agricultural shop and they tell me that they're down 1/4 on the stock. I went to buy some insect netting for the community garden that I've started because I'm so worried about food poverty in my area. I thought, let's stop complaining about it and let's start doing something about it. So I started a community garden to try and help feed people in my community. So I bought some insect netting and I got the last roll of insect net that the shop had because they can't get any more. So there are augurs, we're seeing that there are aspects, hints from the stockpiled nation that we have lived in for some years, for months now. There's a lot of shops that a lot of stockpiling, and I think we're starting to see that fraying. And the farmers that I'm looking at now online, because that's where most of my bubble is these days, their silence actually speaks volumes, and the lack of political placards in a lot of the large landowners' fields in these last elections, I think, also was quite significant. So I think that perhaps the realities are starting to dawn. I've got a lot of time from Martin Kennedy, who's the president of the NFU of Scotland. He's a very nice bloke, a very genuine and sincere person. It's my view of him. And I detect in his messages that I see online and the statesman that I see from him a deep, deep disappointment, a deep sense of betrayal, and a serious concern. So I think that Mr. Johnson's government is juggling a lot of plates at the moment, and I think they may well be about to start tumbling around our ears. It's just whether or not Scotland is in a position to do something positive about it or not is the issue.
Thanks, Ruth. Jim, are you hearing us now any better?
Yes, I am.
Brilliant.
There's a definite delay, but I'll catch up with you.
All right, thanks, Jim. Ruth was saying that she's detecting signs from some of the farming sector that they are expecting the Brexit storm to arrive relatively soon, and she was saying that she thought that this was reflected in the lack of large political signs in certain farmers' fields during the last Scottish election. If that assumption is correct, and we're proceeding on the basis that some farmers feel that the Tories are prepared to destroy their businesses, and these you would presume would be larger farming enterprises, for example. What do you think? Either hill farmers or crofters or smallholders, what prospects do you think they have of continued support from Westminster?
Well, the point that Ruth made, that farmers are starting to get the sense that Brexit is coming. I'm not entirely convinced that that's happening in the livestock sector, because as I've said before, the trade for them is very, very good. So, guys, I don't know what's happening with the system, but I'm just keeping getting reverberation. The livestock sector is very good at the moment, and the livestock farmers that I'm speaking to, they have no sense at the moment that there is a problem. As I've been speaking to them during the week, some of them didn't even realise the Australian trade deal was going to go through, and if they had heard something about the trade deal, they didn't actually know what the implications of it were. And I'm not talking about guys that aren't switched on. Some of these people that I've been speaking to are some of the brightest, most politically aware people in the industry, but they hadn't switched on to the fact that this trade deal is coming down the road. So when you look at the Brexit situation, they're getting good trade. There's a lot of stockpiling that has been happening, but they're seeing prices now that they've never witnessed before in decades. Some of them have never seen prices like this before. So they're thinking, yeah, everything's okay.
That's an interesting analysis without getting too deeply into it, and obviously, as you say, we're in the midst of the season when lamb prices are foremost in people's minds. What do you think is driving the rise in lamb prices? Is it a change in imports or exports?
No, it's basically supply and demand. There was a huge amount of lamb was taken out of the system last year on 2 occasions when we were coming to the deadlines for we could have had a no deal Brexit, so everybody was selling lamb, everybody was selling beef at that time, and the trade was marginally lower than normal, but people were getting rid of lamb at that time. There was a lower lambing percentage rate across Scotland last year. But the big thing was that people offloaded stock early in anticipation of what was going to happen to prices if we had a no deal Brexit. So that was a big factor in what's happening just now. There is a severe shortage. We don't have a free trade deal with other countries at the moment, so there isn't the same amount of imports coming in. But one of the areas where Ruth's probably absolutely correct, that farmers are beginning to notice it, is the farmers who are going to need workers. If you're looking at the berry farms and the vegetable farms, in fact, I was speaking to the manager of my brother's restaurant today, and the biggest fear that they have is being able to get staff to come over from the EU. And as you were just pointing out, there are people who are trying to come back into the country are being stopped because Border Force don't know what the rules are, or are enforcing rules that aren't actually there. It's little things that are just going to start creeping up bit by bit. So as we come through this period just now, as the beef price starts to stabilise and come back down to normal levels, as lamb prices start to go down, it's what happens after that the real effects of Brexit are going to be felt, because we're not going to have the EU market to go into. We'll have normal supply and demand levels, and then if you get this Australian deal going through at the same time, that's when we're really starting going to feel the pain.
Thanks, Jim. That's great insight, and certainly it sounds like this is a story that we're going to have to continue to watch for months, if not years, going forward. Now, as you're saying, the impact is not necessarily immediate across the whole sector. Now, as you mentioned, the latest Brexit-related development from Westminster is the possible prospect of a trade deal with Australia. So we'll have a look at that next. So putting to one side the vast difference in sizes between the EU market and the Australian markets, and putting to one side the Australian farming methods, for example, the use of growth hormones, which are banned in the EU in half of all of beef production, are contrary to our current standards in Scotland, and putting to one side that Perth, Australia is more than 9,000 miles away from Perth, where you were born, Jim. Putting all of those things to one side for a moment, Jim, what do you think is the first thing that we should look at when this proposed Australian trade deal is put onto the table?
The first thing that absolutely jumps out at you is it's tariff-free, quota-free. It's basically unfettered access for beef and lamb coming from Australia into the UK market. Now, in reality, the Australians are saying they could multiply their levels of beef coming into the country tenfold. But what does that actually mean in numbers? What does that actually mean in volume? Because we import beef into this country already, vast majority of it coming from Ireland, and that won't come in from Ireland. So can we afford to absorb beef coming in from Australia, for instance? And the probability is that we could, but we're going to have a different standard in animal welfare and how the animals are reared. That's a separate issue. That's, take that out of the equation at this moment in time. The real danger from this deal is that it sets the precedent for all the other deals that come behind it. So if we have unfettered access for Australian beef and lamb, if we do a trade deal with New Zealand, with America, with Canada, any of the North American countries, the Mercosur countries, all of the places that the UK are saying, these are the places that we want to go, these are the places where we're going to get these big opportunities. Every one of those then has to have exactly the same deal as Australia has had under WTO rules. So this is the template of what the deal is going to look like as we go forward. Now, if that's the case, one of the American criteria for putting beef and lamb into this country, or predominantly beef into this country, is there'll be no labelling. There won't be any country of origin. As far as the Americans are concerned, beef is beef is beef. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter what your rearing system is. So the UK government are saying, yeah, okay, but what we'll do is we'll make sure that we maintain the standards that are here in this country. But the parish amendment that was put in the agricultural bill back in 2019-2020 was to say that no beef or lamb could come into this country, or chicken, that hadn't met the same level of standards that we have in this country. The Tories voted it down. They voted it out of hand, including the new leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Scottish Tory Party, sitting now in Holyrood, Douglas Ross. They voted that amendment down. That would have been the protection. So even if we did do a trade deal, you would then be looking at pasture-fed beef or pasture-fed lamb coming into this country adhering to the same standards as we do. But they voted that down. So the trade deal that they're doing with Australia just now is the template for the one that we'll do for America. And the Americans have an absolute prerequisite that there is no labelling. So effectively, we're looking at our supermarkets being the gatekeepers. And I had this conversation when I was on here before. We're now looking at our supermarkets being the gatekeepers of the standards that we adhere to, and putting it on their shelves and saying, yep, this is prime Scotch beef, and this is beef from someplace else. And what will happen, bit by bit, time over time, that beef that is so much cheaper will be bought, and that will become the norm, because by and large, people are coming out of a COVID crisis. We're going to have lots of unemployment. People are going to be watching their purse, and we're going to have to try and compete so that the beef that we produce in this becomes so niche that it's only going to be the very wealthy that are going to be able to afford it. It won't be the staple of the people who are living in this country. So there's a societal issue there that you have to think yourself, is it right that only the rich people can afford to buy the beef in this country because we're importing something from another country which doesn't have the same standards? So that's probably the first issue that I would have with it, is that that's the template for every other deal that's coming behind it. There's a whole lot of other things that we would need to discuss further, but that's the first thing I would be worried about.
Of course. Thanks, Jim. We'll come back to the societal issues, and we'll certainly come back to Douglas Ross in a minute. But first of all, Ruth, are there any other key considerations in what you've heard about this proposed free trade deal with Australia?
So many. Just where do I start? So, I mean, trade Twitter is saying, oh, it's really unlikely that the Tories will capitulate on the food standards aspect in terms of the growth hormone, because they had that as their red line. Well, how many red lines have they had? It's like Boris Johnson is out chalking red lines up on his walls, his wonderfully tasteful wallpaper, and he just walks right past them. So I don't believe that. However, trade Twitter assures the world that it is unlikely that the growth hormones will be allowed in. Apparently, this is going to be announced at the G7 in June, so we'll hold our breaths and see. But you've got malathion, which is an insecticide, which Australia allows at 100 times the rate that it is allowed in this country, with huge implications for health. There's just so many other pesticides and insecticides that are allowed, which are of an environmental impact, but also potentially are involved with developing cancers, with fetal abnormalities, with helping people, developing Parkinson's. It's implicated in many sort of neurological issues. So the point that Jim made, and actually it is fundamental, is about social justice. At the moment, no matter whether you're going to a food bank, and in itself that is an abomination that we have food banks, but whether you're getting food from a food bank or whether you're getting the unique stuff from some artisan shelf, all the food that people eat is reared to the same standard. It's produced to the same standard. And there will be a not just a two-tier, but a multi-tier system. And our children in our schools, it's going to be hidden. You know, the food in our institutions is going to be the kind of like bulk stuff pumped in. And Jim says that it's going to be cheaper. It may well be cheaper to start off with until our own homegrown businesses are put out of business, and then you'll watch the prices start to creep up. And so there's that. And then, for example, the animal welfare issue. You've got the practice of mulesing in Australia, where basically they cut without any anesthetic. They cut the back end of sheep off. They just slice it off because there's all sorts of issues with fly strike, and so they would say, well, we have to do it for the animals' well-being in the long term. But basically, these creatures have their back ends flayed without an anesthetic. Then you've got the whole issue of creatures being sent across the world. If you're not exporting frozen animals, frozen carcasses, then you have. I literally lived in Perth, Australia, for a number of years, and when you went into Fremantle, you would hear for miles away. You would hear the noise of the animals out on the ships waiting to be sent off to Saudi Arabia, for example, and it was brutal. In the storms, you would hear them. If the ships couldn't move off because of storms, you would hear it, and then after several days, you could smell it from several miles away. Huge livestock issues with these animals dying at a horrific rate. And then there was the ship that disappeared. When the Suez Canal was closed recently, a shipment of livestock going off in preparation for the Eid celebrations, and it just kind of disappeared. So the prospect is that those animals were just chucked overboard when they got too much to handle. Nobody knows. That is a supposition, but it is the fear. So apart from the economic aspect, which is significant, food and drink is I think 15 billion, worth 15 billion to Scotland's economy. Is the largest employer in Scotland is within the food and drink sector. So it doesn't. The cynic in me wonders how much a government which was prepared to watch the mining communities be decimated, was prepared to watch the communities that sort of lived on manufacturing disappear. And evidence has been given admitting this in 2012 at Westminster. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but a government employee, a politician of the time, was saying that it's just the way things go. I'm looking at what's happened to the fisheries, and I actually quite believe that there is a sector of Westminster that would be quite prepared to let Scotland's economy plummet and our communities have second clearances all over again. I'm quite prepared to believe that they're perhaps not even worried that would be an issue for us.
Ruth, is it fair to say that significant sections or important sections of Scottish agriculture are under threat from the Tories' determination to secure any deal with Australia?
I think there's a number of sectors across the whole of all of the nations. I mean, look at Wales. Wales is disproportionately similar to us. The areas of less favoured status, the landscape that they have, the traditions that they have. The Welsh economy is very much tied up too. There's the cheesemakers in Cheshire are extremely concerned about this. You look at the Back British Farming campaign. They're deeply concerned about it. I mean, it's not just about the Scottish economy, which was a particular area of concern for me, but looking at farming Twitter, there's a lot of serious concern about what's going to happen to especially the family farms.
Now, Jim, you mentioned his name first, but we'll come back to him now. The Scottish Tories frontman Douglas Ross wrote during the election about how he was prioritising and would protect Scottish agriculture. How do you react to those assertions from Douglas Ross?
There's a real irony to Douglas Ross. If I seem to remember correctly, Ruth's talking about red lines there. Douglas Ross absolutely determined that his fishing constituency would not be sold down the river. They would be protected at all costs. It just wasn't an issue. And the day the deal was signed, bang, the fishermen went overboard. He after I won the nomination for the election to Perthshire South and Kinross-shire, I very much played in the fact that I'd been in farming for 30 years of my life, and that I was brought up in the town and made my living in the countryside, so I could represent a very diverse constituency here, because I could bridge the gap between the two, which is what I've been doing for the last 23, 24 years after setting up the farmers market anyway. And within 4 days of me having won the nomination to stand in this seat, Douglas Ross had sent a letter to every farmer in the constituency talking about the fact that he would be the farmer's champion, because he was the son of a dairyman and he'd been to agricultural college, and that what he wanted to do was nothing more than was to be a farm worker just like his dad. And yet here he is, he's now the leader of the Tory party. Ironically enough, I'm now sitting in Parliament as well. And every time Douglas Ross gets an opportunity to speak, he talks about his love for dairy cows and all the rest of it. And yet he didn't support the parish amendment to protect the welfare standards of food that was coming to this country. So I have absolutely no faith whatsoever that Douglas Ross is going to do anything to protect Scottish farming. And I'm going to go back to the point that Ruth was talking about there with Martin Kennedy. I was watching Martin's, I know Martin personally, he's a lovely guy, he's a very hard-working farmer, very, very good farmer. I was watching his tweets this morning, and by and large, we've seen it in the past where if the NFU put up something complaining about Westminster, there is an avalanche of people particularly from the Yes movement, saying you voted for it, it's up that you take what you get, you vote Tory all the time, which I'm sick of saying that's not necessarily the case. There are big landowners who will put big posters up in farm fields, and I get that, but it's not true to say that farmers all vote Tory. They certainly don't. But Martin's tweets that he's putting out publicly just now, he's clearly really, really upset about the fact that this trade deal could go through. Now, you have to remember, this trade deal isn't actually finalised yet. It'll be done by June, but all of the indications are that it's going to happen. So Douglas Ross will go along with whatever it is that Westminster tells them to do. Martin Kennedy, I'm going to be very interested to see how he reacts as we go along, because we might actually be seeing a bit of a shift here. When you see how Martin reacted this morning, I'm going to be very interested to see how he develops that narrative as we get closer to a deal being done. But I think one of the real points that we need to be asking ourselves is, we've got Alistair Jack sitting in Westminster. He's in the cabinet. I know for a fact that he was in a cabinet meeting with Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Michael Gove and various others yesterday talking about the Australian deal. What's he doing when he's sitting in that room? Now, he puts himself across as being the supporter of the farming industry in this country. What's he saying in that room? How much support is he putting there? Is he standing up for farming in Scotland, or is he Westminster's man in Scotland? There are things going to play out here over the next 4 or 5 weeks that really could determine which direction we're going to go as a country. Because as far as I can see, as long as we've got Tories who are prepared to absolutely decimate whatever industry it is in Scotland, as Ruth said, we've got the aftermath. We've got 3 generations of people who've never worked in the steel mills and the coal mines. We've got drug abuse, we've got alcoholism, we've got depression, we've got unemployment, we've got all the issues that come from not being able to find a job. And that goes back to the 80s, when they absolutely wiped out our heavy industry. I've got no doubt at all that they will do exactly the same thing to the food and drink sector, the agricultural sector, the fishing sector, because they don't care. They simply don't care. So I want to know what Alistair Jack's going to do, and I want to see how Douglas Ross is going to defend his Westminster parliamentarian colleagues in doing what they are doing just now. We're in for a very interesting 2 or 3 weeks, that's for sure.
You make a good point there, Jim. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, Mr. Jack diversified the family away from farming into an event hire business and then into self-storage. So perhaps he and the family voted with their feet some time ago. I think his financial success came from something very far removed from farming. But what we'll do now is we'll move on a little bit. We'll touch on one thing, Jim, that you mentioned, and we'll just explore it a little bit more. I had put a few important points to one side earlier, but you came back to it. And that was really that, and Ruth has spoken about it too, and that was really, I was just going to tease out that whilst Australian beef can fairly be described as safe to eat, the exposure of the use of hormones in the beef industry is linked to a number of broader issues that may affect human health and the health of the environment. And I don't think that's controversial. So, Jim, I'll ask you first, and you did touch on it already, I appreciate that. As a livestock farmer of many, many years, what do you think will be the impact or the impacts if we begin to import Australian beef in particular, which has been raised in different ways and to different standards than beef in Scotland?
And I tell you that, if you don't mind, I'm going to very quickly pull something up here on Twitter. And this isn't just a Scottish issue. Now, predominantly, I'm concerned about Scotland. But there's a tweet on here. I literally read it 5 minutes before I came on air here, and it's from a Dominic Elson, who's a farmer somewhere down in the south of England. And he said, a trade expert on BBC Radio 4 today just explained how the UK needs to remove protection for animal welfare in order to compete in the global market for beef and lamb. And he asked the question, is this what consumers want? Is this what farmers want, and all for 0.01% of a GDP? The introduction of hormone-fed beef, or of standards that we don't normally reach, that we would not accept in this country. There's two ways that we can either that we can deal with that in this country. And I organised a seminar down in Stirling Market just after the EU referendum 2 or 3 years ago, and we had about 100 farmers in the room, and we talked about what would farming in Scotland look like in a post-Brexit era. And as we talked through all the things that we're talking about here just now, one extremely angry, frustrated, scared, and I'm going to use the word scared because he's terrified that he's going to lose his family business, beef farmer said, well, if that's the stuff that we're going to be importing, we'll have absolutely no choice but to put bloody hormones in the beef that we're producing. How the hell are we supposed to compete if that's what they're going to be importing? And that's terrifying, because if we're going to go for a race to the bottom in terms of the standards of the stuff that we're prepared to feed to our families, then all the problems with Ruth will have the figures to her hand far better than me, but you've got far greater incidence of food poisoning in America. You've got much greater problems with obesity. You can't be pumping hormones into beef, feeding it to people and not expecting it to be having an effect. If we're going to have a race to the bottom, you're going to be into industrial farming here in Scotland. Family farms are going to go out of business, and we're going to see a dramatic change in the cultural makeup of the country. You're not going to have these most remote and rural areas in Scotland occupied by farming families who are there holding the community together, providing the money to the local garage, to having kids going to schools. They're not going to be employing farm labourers. So we're going to see a huge cultural shift here in Scotland. And for what? What are we gaining out of it? We're getting what out of these trade deals? It just, the whole hormone injected beef is just one aspect of it. It's when you open yourself up to that level of lack of control, lack of labelling, people don't have the choice, then, it really is a slippery slope. And I don't see how small farming families manage to survive it. I honestly see a massive cultural change will happen in Scotland if we allow this to happen.
Thanks, Jim. Ruth, turning to you, Jim was opening up something I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. If we think of agricultural production in the United States and Canada, but the US in particular, and also agricultural production in Australia, we see, I think it's fair to say, a predominance of what we would regard as agribusinesses, very large, almost quasi-industrial concerns, which farm very large areas of land in a very intensive and extremely efficient way. And I think it's fair to say that we.
Let's just, well, I was going to stop you right there. It's not
Go on.
efficient and it is industrial. It's to say that it's
Yes.
because you have to look at the global impact on the
Yes.
environmental issues, the welfare of the livestock. When you're looking at these big feedlots, just go and look at the feedlots. That's not grass the animals are on. It's you're looking at animals that are being fed the product of a felled Amazon rainforest. They're being fed on corn, they're being fed on soy. They end up with the most appalling intestinal disruption because this is not the way a cow is supposed to be fed. And then you end up with this slash and burn philosophy in the abattoirs. So you've got these animals being raced through with very poor animal welfare standards. They end up with viscera literally all over the place, contaminating the meat. The rates, Jim's right, the rates of food poisoning in America are 10 times per head of population than they are in the UK. And it's grisly. There are no vets. The vets aren't there, so the animal welfare is low. There's nobody checking the pig heart incisions to make sure that there's not ghastly worms that are going to go into your groin or infest your brain and kill you horribly. These are things that matter, and these are things that the Americans have made clear that they don't want to be checked upon. So it's one thing to say, yes, we will lose our crofters, we will lose our smallholders, we will also lose our rare breeds, we will also lose the connection, the farm to fork connection, such as there is within Scotland. You're only over 8 miles from a farm. I mean, that's amazing. That is an amazing thing. And the Scottish government, for all its failings, is doing an awful lot to try and connect youngsters to the farms. And let's talk about the climate emergency. How is it okay to have these massively industrial feedlots happening? I was at that meeting that Jim organised and it was really good. And I watched James Withers, who's a really good bloke, the CEO of Scotland Food and Drink, is basically trying to hold Scotland's economy together, pretty single-handed as far as I can see at the moment. And he put his head in his hands when that farmer stood up. And Jim's right, that farmer was scared. He was scared. It was a visceral reaction he had. He leapt to his feet. And he said, we have to do this. How can we compete otherwise? And James Withers said, it's game over. In fact, Johnny Hall as well, he was saying of the NFU, it's game over. Knocked my Wi-Fi out, waving my arms around in a fury. We can't do the stack 'em high and sell 'em low. And I'm a vegetarian who campaigns for abattoirs. And the reason I campaign with Keep Scotland the brand for Scotch beef and Scotch lamb and specially selected pork, just along the road from me, there's happy porkers running around in fields. That's the way pigs are supposed to live. The sows are supposed to be able to nurse their piglets. This is the way farming is supposed to be. If we are going to have a meat industry, then it has to be the kind of meat that Scottish farmers produce, where animals are out on fields, where they feel the sun on their back, they have natural behaviours with their offspring. To go backwards is an abomination. If we are going to be serious about the climate emergency, if we're going to be serious about food standards, we're going to be serious about the well-being and health of our children, we have to maintain our food standards. And all the research shows that people really care about it. And yes, Jim's right. Because of COVID and unemployment and ghastly government policies, which have seen the UN rapporteur on food standards on poverty describe the Westminster government as intentionally cruel. We have had decades of assaults on our economy. We cannot then have an assault allowed to happen on the well-being of our people, because it's as fundamental. The food that we put into our children at our schools, it is a fundamental building block of their lives and will affect our health services and just our grandchildren. Let's just take a moment and have a look. For 0.01% of the economy, there's more to this. There's way more to this than just food and drink. Whatever it is the Conservative government is up to, it's not about the economic benefits of food and drink. So one has to wonder whose offshore account is going to get pumped up with whatever deal is coming, because it's a dirty business. I do suspect that some of this Australian rush is because they're very keen to see the issues with the border and the Irish Sea and the divergence in standards. I think that they're kind of keen to see any disruption in Ireland play out with Australia, so that
Ruth, we lost you there for a moment.
Sorry. It's my conspiracy
okay?
theory about President Biden and Australia. I'm convinced that the UK. Sorry, my internet's rubbish.
And it's conspiring to keep from us your conspiracy
theory.
But
I'll get my tinfoil hat on.
I'll tell you what, though. All joking aside, I take great exception to the fact that she said, for all the failings of the Scottish Government. I'm not having that, Ruth. Let's have less of that. Thank you very much.
I shall speak my mind, and you cannot stop me, Mr. Fairlie.
I'll unplug you.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you both for helping to unpack this proposed Australian trade deal. I'd like to spend now a little time talking, and we were moving that direction just now, but I'd like to spend a little time talking about the future for farming in Scotland. The SNP is committed to protecting farm incomes, protecting our rural populations, and supporting farmers as food producers, while simultaneously balancing that support with marketing the quality food that we produce, both selling it here and to a global market. So, Ruth, you were touching on it. First of all, what does sustainable farming, sustainable for rural populations, for producers, for consumers, and for future generations, what do you think that looks like in Scotland?
I think it looks like sensible approaches. I don't think it looks like en masse rewilding. I think it looks like, rather than covering hillsides in swathes of green forest, sort of green deserts rather, we perhaps get back to deciduous trees and animals grazing under trees on hillsides that couldn't be used for arable. I think the thought of turning arable farms. In my area, there's a very big estate owner who tells me that they were approached by an agent who is looking to basically buy up their amazing under tree cattle farm and moorland onto trees. And when they basically showed him the door, he said he had another 5 estates to go for. So I think we do need to be concerned. I've spoken to Fergus Ewing and Murray Goodjohn about this in the past, saying that I am very concerned that the rewilding agenda might not get it right. And I think that is an issue. I think we have a lot of good work that we can do in terms of rewilding, sensible rewilding, and looking at our moorlands and making some really positive changes. But I think it needs to be done sensitively and actually listening to people who really know what they're talking about. Sorry, my internet. And in terms of supporting farming, I think we have to have mobile abattoirs. I think that's crucial, partly for rare breeds as well.
Yes, of course. I can think of from my own experience the closing of the abattoir on Islay, for example, and the impact that had on both pork and lamb and beef production on both Jura and Islay. So your point's well made. Jim, I was going to think a little bit more widely for a moment. We speak a great deal on Broadcasting Scotland about the climate emergency, and I'm pretty sure that we're going to continue to do so. What do you think that Scottish farmers will face as our climate and the associated weather patterns become more extreme and more unpredictable?
There's absolutely no doubt that we're going to have to face the climate emergency. And I'll tell you, you know what? We've spoken tonight an awful lot of negativity There's been an awful lot of angst in the conversation tonight about all the bad things and all the rest of it. But there's a hell of a lot of good stuff going on as well. I was lucky enough I was invited today to go and visit Comrie Primary, and there's a lad up there, a business called Wild Heart Bakery, John Costello, John Cushley, and what they're doing is they're taking heritage wheats and they're planting them in the school, and they're growing heritage wheats, and they're going to mill it, and they're going to show it to bake bread. I had an idea to try and develop Perth and Kinross-shire South when I got elected. That I wanted to see every primary child, by the time they left primary 7, be able to cook a pot of soup for themselves, show them the connection where their food comes from, if they've got the space to allow them to grow it in a garden, and really build up that between the food that we grow, the food that we see in the fields, what it means to people, how it impacts on their health and everything else. And one of the great things about Curriculum for Excellence, and this is one of the things that came from the head teacher today, she loves Curriculum for Excellence on the basis that what that does is it allows her to do all of these things with the kids. So they're not just teaching the kids how to make a pot of soup by the time they leave primary 7. They're making a pot of soup every week. And then they're going out into the forest area and they're doing outside forest teaching, and they take their homemade soup with them. And they're out in nature. They're getting that connection with nature. They're getting the connection with the environment. They're an eco school. They're a health promoting school, and the things that they are doing are fantastic. And the thing is, that's been replicated all over the country. There are schools, even just in my constituency, there are schools doing this kind of work all over the place. So there's a real desire and awareness for us to be as globally responsible as we can by looking after what we can look after. And I'm delighted that Mary Gujan has been given the job of Cabinet Secretary for Agriculture. She's a fantastic girl, young woman I should say. She's a really sharp person. She knows the brief. She's been working in it before. And I know that she's absolutely committed to making sure that agriculture in Scotland is supported, that we are allowed to continue to produce beef and lamb and barley and the vegetables, the soft fruit sector. We're starting to look at hydroponics. We're starting to look at vertical growing. There are fantastic, amazing things happening in the industry. There are some really vibrant young thinkers coming into the industry. So there's a huge amount of positivity. But we've got to take our climate emergency seriously. So the £250 million that the Scottish Government are putting into peatland restoration, for instance, that's going to be a fantastic carbon sink. And Ruth's right, this blanket afforestation of Sitka spruce, is that there is a problem with that. We need to have a more balanced approach to how we're actually going to do these tree planting. It shouldn't just be about numbers. It should be about the right trees in the right place. And that's something I'm committed to looking at as we go forward. There is challenges that we're going to face in seasonality. There are challenges that we're going to face with weather patterns. But there's one thing for sure. Farmers in Scotland are utterly resilient. They're real grafters. They're innovators. They'll find the solutions to whatever it is that comes their way. And we've got a Scottish Government who are absolutely determined to make sure that they achieve the ambitions that they have. Ambition 2030, we touched on it earlier on, is about the food and drink sector being worth £30 billion to the Scottish economy. I speak about it all the time, but we need to keep that target in mind because it's so important. And the farming industry completely underpins everything that ambition is about. So there's brilliant things coming. There's brilliant things there. We should be aware of the threats, but we absolutely have to not take our eye off the fact that we have got a fantastic industry, from the people who are growing it to the people who are cooking it to the people that are serving it. Now, the other thing that I would like to touch on is not about agriculture. It's how we as society view certain individuals who are in industries. So a waiter, I touched it earlier on about migrants coming into this country or EU citizens coming into this country. A sommelier is not regarded on the list that the UK government.
Hello, are you there?
I'm here.
I think Jim's gone. I think the internet ghosts have got to him.
I think you're right, Ruth. Can you hear me, Ruth?
I can.
Okay, no problem. I was just noticing the time.
My internet's
Jim
great.
was opening. Jim was opening of important areas that I was keen that we talk about tonight, but unfortunately time has run away with us. I'm not surprised with two such excellent guests who are able to talk at length and with such insight into such an important topic. So whilst Jim may have dropped off, what I do need to say is thank you to you, Ruth, and to Jim, both for taking the time to join us and to talk with us and to discuss these topics with us this Friday evening. We're really, really grateful and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, Maggie will be here at 12 noon on Sunday with the full Scottish, so please tune in and join her then. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend.